Welcome to this episode of the Lifting Cues podcast. This is another dual episode of the podcast. I have my friend and colleague, Coach Garrick Hutchinson, aka Coach G, on the podcast, who I get to work with and train with on a regular basis. We compete in powerlifting together. He is heavier than me, so we don't compete against each other. So we get to train together and lift together and coach together. And he's a great person that I really get to learn from. I forget sometimes that he is only 25 years old. The future is super bright for this guy, and you're going to hear so much good information from this podcast about strength training and how to make progress, how to, start out your journey and get all the way to wherever it is that you want to go. We went deep on this podcast. We nerded out about strength training and lifting weights like we like to do. And that's why this is the Lifting Cues podcast. We answered a ton of different questions. So I really hope you like this episode with Coach G. And if you do, please like, rate, subscribe, share this podcast on social media, tag me, Coach Q_fitness, tag Coach G, Coach_G_CSCS. Let us know what you liked, what you didn't, but let's dive right into this conversation. Welcome back to another dual episode of the Lifting Cues podcast, the second of its kind. Today, I welcome Coach Garrick Hutchinson, aka Coach G, into the studio / home gym so that we can talk all things lifting. Welcome, G. This is your first time on a podcast, right?
Second time, actually.
Second time?
I was on one in college, and I wish I could shout it out, but I don't even remember the name of it. But thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself as a coach, what's your background, what got you into coaching, your experience, and everything like that.
Gotcha. I'll try to keep this short and sweet, give you just the basic details. But I guess I'll start with why I got into coaching from the jump is I grew up with a lot of great coaches, and I feel like with every great coach I had, I was pushed to be a little bit better in different areas. And I think I was really inspired by all the coaches I've had growing up. I'm a wrestler, which I'll always be a wrestler. So I grew up wrestling. I wrestled from 5th grade all the way up until 5 years of college, had so many great coaches, and that really pushed me into the field of coaching. I didn't know what kind of coach I wanted to be.
Yeah.
Did I want to be a wrestling coach, fitness? But I got to a point where I realized I liked lifting, I liked fitness just as much as I liked wrestling. So that's kind of what brought me over into the fitness area of coaching. And so I pursued that at Gannon. I was originally going to school to be a physical therapist. A little bit too boring for me. Nothing against physical therapy, but wasn't the direction I wanted to go, at least not in that season of my life. So I just pursued a master's in exercise science. I started coaching. The day I started my master's program was my first day as a coach as well, and I've been coaching ever since, so I love it.
And you've been at Erie Fitness Academy the whole time, right?
Yep,
That's
just
been the
over 2
experience.
years I've been at Erie Fitness Academy, doing all kinds of stuff. One-on-one coaching, group coaching with TFW classes. Quinn and I coach together every Monday morning. Then doing some online coaching now as well.
That's awesome. It's awesome. Is there anything that you really specialize in coaching-wise, or you want to specialize in, or is there a type of training that you love to do more than
This
others?
won't come as a surprise to you, but I like the basics. I like basic strength training. I think it's pretty much a foundation for anything you want to get good at in fitness. Like, it's, in my opinion, it's the best base to get you to be able to do all the other fancy stuff. So I definitely specialize in basic barbell training, learning the basics of barbell training and progressing those through it and helping people get as strong as they can and build confidence and discipline through strength training.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say there's a specific type of person I work with, at least in person. I work with lots of different people, and that's kind of what I really enjoy about it, because no matter the person, I see firsthand the benefits they get from strength training. And, while working on all those lifestyle habits as well.
Yeah.
Online, I typically like to work with people that I was or people that I used to be. So, like, people that are coming out of athletics and don't really know what to do now that athletics isn't a part of their life anymore. So that's kind of the route I'm going online.
Yep. And what's your favorite part about being a coach? I know you had a lot of coaches that had an impact on you. What's your favorite part about finally getting to be the coach and get to have those experiences?
I think it's really those light bulb moments for people that, when it's people come in because they want to lose a certain amount of weight and they think, I'll lose this weight and then I'll be happy. And, they do lose that weight, but then it becomes a lifestyle and they realize like how much more there is to fitness that's not just related to what a scale says, and that I see their confidence improve, their mood improve, the way they interact with other people improve. And it all starts with like just wanting to lose weight, but you really get to see people grow as human beings and stop worrying so much about just the scale.
Yeah, there's so many other goals that come along and they're like, my quality of life has completely changed. Now I have these strength goals that I never even knew existed or wanted to do in general. But this is also the Lifting Cues podcast. And we want to talk about Coach G, the lifter, because he's pretty impressive as well. So let's... who is Coach G, the lifter? Where did that journey start, and take us kind of all the way through?
So, like I said, I always thought that, I've thought for a long time that like just getting really strong is going to be the best background for me as an athlete. And I still believe that to this day, at least when you're developing a base. So when I was lifting in the off seasons of wrestling, my goal was pretty simple: get as strong as possible. I didn't always go about that the right way, but in high school, you can win a lot of matches just by being ridiculously strong. And then it made that transition to college a lot easier because I was already pretty strong.
Right. You had that base, and then it was just develop the skill on top of that.
Exactly. Right. And through that, I kind of realized, like, in the off seasons, it was like I'm sad every time I have to stop training as hard in the weight room or lifting as hard.
Yeah.
I wasn't great at balancing the two. And I would, every summer, once I got to about my sophomore year of college, I ended up, I would only get as strong as I was the previous summer. So, I'd do the weight cut, wouldn't lift as hard, and then the next summer would roll around, and I'd have that 3 to 4 month stretch where I'd just end up right back to where I was. So once wrestling was over, I needed another competitive outlet. Powerlifting made the most sense, and here I am.
Yeah, awesome. Speaking of powerlifting, could you give us some of your background in that? How many times have you competed? What have you accomplished? What's your best lifts?
Yeah, so first competition was in April of last year. I've competed 3 times since then. So I competed in April of 23. I competed in December of 23, and then my third meet was in April of 24. To this point, my best lifts are a 502 squat, 336 bench, and a 562 deadlift. Even I surprised myself a little bit with that one.
Hell yeah, that one was awesome. And funny enough, like, you're actually the person who got me into powerlifting. Like, when I came to Erie Fitness Academy, you had just done a meet, and I was like, oh man, this looks cool. Like, I haven't strength trained in so long, and I was coming into this gym as a coach, and I was like, I need a new sort of like outlet, because like the bodybuilding thing, I was like, I'm probably never gonna do a show. I was like, I don't think I want to ever get that lean or like go through that process. So I was like, I need something, because I'm just going through the motions. And then I was like, you know what, I'll start powerlifting with G, and that story is just continuing to be written.
Yeah,
now.
It's funny that when you started, I remember like, once we got to know each other a little bit, we got to train together a little bit, just getting some quick lifts in. It was just like little shots from me and a couple other coaches, like, dude, you got to sign up for this meet.
Yeah.
Like, you got to do it.
And it just kind of grew the whole thing, and we all decided to do it. And yeah, it's been awesome, and it's been cool to see that journey, especially coming from the fact that we come from the same place.
Oh yeah, we got to touch on that.
Like, if you guys don't know this, me and G went to the same high school. We're about 8 years apart, so we didn't really cross paths, but our journey started in the exact same place. I started out as a football player at Baldwin High School. I lifted in the gym that was your wrestling room.
Yeah.
Oddly enough. Probably
I do
not
remember
nearly
that.
as
I was
nice.
a youth wrestler when that was going on.
Yeah. So tiny gym. My sophomore year, we finally got some like new equipment. By the time I left, they moved the gym, made it bigger to what you know as it. But the fact that we came from there kind of took similar journeys through like athletics, and then wound up working at the same gym in Erie. Oddly enough, is just a crazy story, and now we're on this journey of powerlifting together.
And it's funny looking back at those high school lifts. It's some of my favorite memories. But for any of you guys like that might be listening and you're starting out, like stuff I would never do now. Like we'd show up to an open lift after school and just decide to max that day.
Every day.
But some of the funnest memories, and
yeah,
you know, there's so many ways to get. Like, you get good at something by sucking at the beginning, so it's fun to look back at the stuff I was doing.
And when you're that young and like malleable, you could just you could basically beat the hell out of yourself. And it's just like stuff seems to work, and then you figure out over time like, oh, this was not the way.
It hurts for like 2 hours, and then you're training the next day.
Then you're fine. Yeah. No, that's cool. But speaking of that, like kind of journey, I think one of the things we wanted to talk about today was people's journey as a lifter and their rate of progress that they should see, and kind of how to go about making sure that we do progress the right way, and you don't have to do all the dumb stuff that we did when you start out, especially, you know, if you are starting out later in life, or you used to be an athlete and you want to get back into it, making sure that you don't think you're that person again. How do we make sure that we continue to progress? And I think one of the things that gets thrown around a lot is there's like 3 stages of lifters. There's a beginner stage, your intermediate stage, and the advanced stage. And it's like, how do you know where you're at in that process? What should you do? So I guess let's back it up all the way to the beginning and talk about, you know, that beginning stage. What should you be doing? What should you be focused on? And what's the rate of progress that we think we should see?
So beginner stage it's so much fun. Like, you want to be a beginner. I think, first of all, before we get into any of this, like, there's a pressure to feel like we need to say that we're more advanced than we are. Like, I don't personally think I'm an advanced lifter yet, based on the progress I'm still making and how quickly that's happening relative to like the truly elite lifters. So if you're watching this, like, don't be afraid to be a beginner. I wish I was still a beginner.
I wish I could go back and be a beginner knowing what I know now. Like, having all the information that we do. I wish every day I could go back and start that process.
And the number one thing I'll say for beginners is hold yourself to a high standard, especially when it comes to your technique. Not saying that your squat has to look like mine or Coach Quinn's, but find a technique that works for you first, and then build a base on that. Like, I really don't think I figured out how to squat for me up until the past 2 years. And, you know, I've been lifting for 10 years now. And it's because it takes playing around with, but I was accepting squats that were too high. I was going too heavy before I nailed down my form. So if you can just bite the bullet, spend a few months being uncomfortable with not being quite sure what you're doing with your form, eventually something's going to click, and now you have a solid foundation to build upon.
Right, and there is no perfect form either. Like you said, don't try to make your squat look like us. You're not shaped like we are. Like, I wish I could squat like G. He's six inches taller than me. I don't know. But different people with different limb lengths, you're going to have different form. Like you said, find the one that works for you. I can give you an example. I've been lifting for almost 20 years now. And just last year, maybe like 2 years ago, did I really figure out my squat. I used to try to keep my chest up too high and like look up to the ceiling, and that caused me to lose power until I finally just shifted my head down and was able to keep my back flatter and like drive through, that my squat really took off. And once I really perfected that, it really, again, took off. So it's like, you're going to play around with this over and over again. And once you get to heavier weights, you might have to tweak some things as well. So,
and I think it's important not to, like, we're not saying not to load it heavier while you're figuring that stuff out, but take the extra time. Like, warm-up sets, you have all these reps to mess with things and get better. You don't have to do a leg day where you only squat once a week. Like, you can practice these lifts, and that's the other thing is you don't need to be doing thousands of different exercises, changing things up. Progress those main lifts, and you're gonna get bigger, stronger, more jacked just by getting stronger in those early stages. It isn't until later on, once you've developed a solid foundation, that you need quite as much accessory work.
Right, yeah, for sure. And like you kind of touched on with the warm-up sets, treat your warm-up set exactly like you would a regular set. It allows you to feel yourself into the movement, make sure that your entire body is in tune with that movement, because most of the barbell lifts that we're talking about are truly full body movements that you need your entire body, and you want to be able to feel into those positions, what every stage of that lift feels like. So treat those warm-up sets as those true practice reps, so that when it does get heavy, it ends up just becoming second nature.
And talking about rate of progress as a beginner is, I think that's when beginners are going to make progress and hit PRs is very frequently.
Yeah.
Now, I think it's important that we kind of preface this by saying if the goal is purely to get stronger, and we can even say build muscle as a beginner, but if your goal is just to get stronger, and you're training, recovering, eating accordingly, these are all important things that get looked over. But as a beginner, you can be making PRs pretty much on a weekly basis,
right,
for longer than you think, if your recovery is where it needs to be and you're training properly.
Yeah. So I think with that too, it's like strength is a skill-based thing and a neurological and psychological thing. You need the confidence to do it. It's like as you continue to get better at the movement and get more confident, you're able to lift more weight. And that's why these beginning stages, you see, the PR every week sort of deal. And I think G puts people on a specific program that is just 5-pound increments every week for as long as we can until it finally kind of taps out.
And it does work, especially for someone that hasn't done that before. But also, that's just to the broader picture. One of the biggest mistakes beginners make is those weekly jumps are just too big, or they're changing rep schemes up every week, where if we just kind of focus on strength, that movement as a whole gets stronger. And it's going like a squat when you're brand new to the gym. Like for you, a low bar back squat isn't going to be enough to make your quads bigger. For someone where it's their first 3 months in the gym, it's absolutely going to be enough to help with that. So if you can, it kind of takes the guessing game out of it a lot.
Yeah, and for those people who do really just want to come in to look better and build that muscle, we still think strength is kind of the way to go to start. Why would that be? Why will they build muscle when they're strength training in the beginning as a beginner or somebody getting back into it? And what will building that base of strength do for your muscle gains in the future?
I think it allows you to slowly understand what hard training is. Because what you can do when you're making weight increases, when you can, slowly progressing those lifts, eventually it's going to get hard. And you're going to learn how to dig deep and figure out what it feels like to become close to failure. And I think the other thing is it makes you a proficient mover. You're better at moving. So I train on machines all the time. I think machines are great, but I think I like training with machines because I understand how to move without them. And I don't think there's as much carryover the other way around.
Right.
Again, something's better than nothing, and you can make a ton of progress with just machines. But from a purely efficiency standpoint, I think you get a lot more by building that base of strength, because you're going to be able to put more effort and intensity into those accessory movements as you progress in strength.
Yeah, and understanding how to, again, stabilize, which you can learn on machines, but it's not the same as putting a bar on your back, or just understanding, like you said, how to get those muscles kind of firing. And there's not much else that will teach you what failure might feel like than a heavy squat.
Right.
Understanding what that feels like on your back when you have to literally dig deep to stand up so that the bar does not fall on you.
And it's a pretty foolproof way to avoid the 3 sets of 12 or 3 sets of 10 trap that a lot of beginners get in, which causes them to not see nearly as much progress as they should as a beginner.
Because you can't lift as heavy. You can't hold the form for 10 reps that's hard enough to actually get you the benefit that you want.
Right, and as a beginner, they don't know all this about training. So when you do, they're looking at more like, if I complete all 10 reps, no matter what, that was a good set. Yeah. Whereas the number of reps isn't really all that important in the grand scheme of things. It's how hard was that set? Are you progressing? Are you progressively overloading? Whereas progressively loading those barbell lifts is going to train a whole lot of muscle mass very efficiently, and it's a pretty foolproof way to make sure that you're actually progressively overloading.
Right. And what kind of volume do you typically recommend for someone at that beginning stage? Because we know from experience when we were beginners, it was like, just do whatever.
Yeah.
Do a million sets of arms, like crush yourself. But do we need that much volume? Should we focus on just gradually increasing it over time? How should we think about the volume of our workout and how much work we're actually doing at that stage?
Yeah, I think for beginners, it's a little bit more across the board, right? Like, so you can, for barbell lifts, as long as it's somewhere in that 3 to 6, 4 to 6 rep range, I think is the best rep range to train in for those barbell lifts. And then volume wise is start with 2 to 3 sets, 2 to 3 hard sets. And then if you feel like you could be making more progress or you're not making progress fast enough, add in a set, train it like that for 4 to 6 weeks, and then see how you're recovering, see if you're progressing more. What we don't want to do is add in a bunch of volume for no specific reason and then just either burn ourselves out or just do way more work than we need to for no reason. So I think it's always better for someone beginning to just start small and slowly build up especially with things like volume, because even I went through a period as probably more of an intermediate lifter where I was doing one really heavy set of deadlifts a week, a couple back off sets, and I was making a ton of progress. So sometimes less is more, especially when it comes to strength training. And I've seen lots of people make pretty impressive increases in strength doing probably less volume than you'd think, especially in that beginner stage.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I used for the powerlifting meet that I went into, because I originally went into this plan to cut down weight significantly, and I was like, I'm gonna have to cut my volume back a ton. And then I ended up just cutting the volume back a ton anyway, and made a ton of gains because I was actually able to recover from it. And I think that might be a piece that beginners miss as well, is they see what people are doing online, or they get, the workout program that the fucking Rock is doing or whatever, and they're like, oh, I should just do
He's
this.
got chains on the Smith machine. It looks sick.
Yeah, he's doing 50 sets of biceps, and his biceps are huge. I want that. So, they go in and do that, but they don't understand what they can actually recover from. So understanding that process. And then as a beginner, how should we be thinking about nutrition and recovery to make sure that we're getting all these benefits as well and setting ourselves up for the rest of the stages?
So I think nutrition-wise, it's really just, you're going to recover pretty well as a beginner. The weights are not heavy enough yet to cause you a ton of stress. So it's really going to come down to what is your goal. If you're someone coming in that wants to lose weight but also wants to prioritize strength training, I think a good way to go about it is in those beginner stages, you can actually recomp a lot more effectively than someone at a
lower body fat percentage.
Exactly.
Or more advanced. Somebody that already has more muscle mass on their body.
Exactly. So when you're starting out, I think being somewhere right around maintenance, maybe even a very small deficit, is going to be the best bet, especially if you want to lose just, maybe it's not an absurd amount of weight, like a reasonable amount of weight, somewhere right around your maintenance calories, prioritizing protein, of course. And if you're not super advanced with your nutrition, which if you're just getting into training, the chances are that you don't.
It's probably not.
If you're eating a real protein source 3 to 4 times throughout the day, your diet's comprised of 80% real foods, and you're sleeping pretty good, you are way beyond most people at your stage. So that's as basic as I can get, and I want to kind of talk about this on how it can relate to a beginner.
Right, exactly. And we want to start you at that beginning stage. We've kind of alluded to it, that you can make gains and you will make gains pretty quickly in both strength and muscle by just starting to train. Your body will begin to adapt, and that's why the body recomp is much easier, because you're going to put on muscle mass much quicker. And, just by doing more activity and just controlling your dietary intake, paying attention to your diet, you'll get around that maintenance, a slight deficit that will help you, burn some more fat, lose some of that fat mass while you build muscle. So just focusing on the basics. Let's make sure we get into the gym, we're pushing ourselves to a good enough intensity and making sure we're continuing to make progress and pushing the weights, I think is enough from that beginner stage.
Yeah, and one more thing about volume and strength training, especially in those beginner stages, is when it comes to strength training, the weight on the bar is, that's what matters the most.
Yep.
So if and let's just make up a scenario where I'm just doing one set of each exercise a week and I'm making progress, I'm making progress. Now, it's
Right.
probably going to be more like 3 or 4, but don't just go adding volume because you think more is always going to be better. If you're consistently making progress with your main barbell lifts, you don't need to just add volume for no particular reason. Everything you add into your training should have a why behind it. Otherwise, you're just adding things to add them.
Yeah, and how much weight to the bar do you need to be adding for it to be considered like good progress? Like someone comes in and they start with just being able to bench the bar. 4 weeks from now, like, is there a, I mean, it's not one size fits all, but like, how much weight should they be aiming to gain in strength? Obviously, you know, your movement ability and everything considered, but say you're, you know, just someone that's novel to lifting with no real movement concerns.
Yeah, we'll assume they've been taught how to pretty much do the lift correctly. For upper body lifts, like I've even taken the small weights and added 2.5 to 1.25 pounds.
Yeah.
And it's just because like things like bench pressing, overhead pressing, that's a way greater percentage of the overall lift than a back squat or a deadlift. So those are like, even if you're just making those small increments multiple times a week, like 5 pounds in a week is huge. Like if I could add 5 pounds truly to my max every week, I'd be a happy man.
Yeah.
So I think really as long as it's progressing, you're good.
Yeah.
Now it should, in those early stages, it should progress probably close to somewhere around 5 pounds a week if you're eating accordingly and everything like that.
Doing everything right.
And also the 5 pounds added to the bar is kind of just to keep people in the mindset of you don't want to overshoot and miss reps. Is like, I'm not a big believer in missing reps in training. We train to complete reps, not miss reps.
Right, especially when you're learning. Like, make sure you're completing reps. Like me, like you're not the bodybuilder that needs to do like just eccentric and me help you up with the bar. Like, we're not there yet. Like, learn how to do the movement proficiently and grind through some of those reps. But yeah, I kind of agree with you on failing.
Yeah, it keeps you on a good track to like learning to maintain your technique that you didn't learn that long ago as weights are slowly getting heavier, rather than like that shock factor of you putting a weight on your back and it's like
This
way
is
heavier
too heavy.
than you've ever handled before too.
Yep. And that will make sure that you are not overshooting to the point where you injure yourself. Now, with injury concerns, lifting is not inherently dangerous. It is when we do something that we are not prepared to do is when I think, besides like the recovery aspect, that's when the most injuries are going to happen. It's not necessarily because of your form or, you know, that your form wasn't perfect or all this stuff. I think it's people mostly just overshoot the load that they're ready for and end up just overstraining the body for something it wasn't trained for. So this will ensure that you just continue to make progress and understand that it is going to take a little bit of time. And I mean, you're the injury guy, so you tell me if I'm.
Oh, I did the barbell rehab online course, and really, it's just the injuries can happen for so many reasons, and you'll spin your head around trying to figure out why an injury occurred.
Yeah.
It could be it's literally hundreds of issues that go into your daily life that could contribute to pain or an injury occurring. So instead of thinking about why this happened, the best thing we can do is immediately look at what our program looks like. As long as our form's good, like as long as it's not atrocious, it's like you know it when you see it.
Yeah.
Like a horrible deadlift, we've all seen one.
Yeah.
Like we want to avoid those extremes. But if your form's pretty solid and you still had an injury, immediately look at programming. You probably did too much, too fast, too soon. That's almost always the case. And Quinn touched on like recovery, but that even goes into doing something that you're not prepared for. If you're not recovered, then you're not prepared for it. So adding small increments of weight to the bar allows you to adapt and then actually be prepared for that next increase in weight. We both pulled deadlifts with not perfectly flat backs, to put it lightly.
I never pull one with a perfectly flat back, to be
And
honest.
I don't hurt myself
Yeah.
because I'm training appropriately. I know right around what my volume should look like what I should be doing progression-wise, when I need to pull back. And maybe that's even something we'll touch on as we get to the more intermediate advanced stages. Like, when do you need to actually pull back on your training? And, everyone's going to be different there. So,
yeah. And so going into that intermediate stage, how do we know when we're ready to go from intermediate to beginner, or when we've become an intermediate? Is there just a set amount of time, or is there a strength goal that we should hit? What should we consider to be going to that intermediate stage?
I don't think of it as a time or strength level, just because there's so many genetic factors involved. And like your first 2 years of training, most of them suck. Like, unless you get someone really good, until I got like a real lifting coach.
Yeah.
I didn't know how to lift. Like, I was making progress because I was 15, 16, but.
And we were lifting hard.
Yeah.
Like, that's the other thing is like, assuming that you dive like all into this thing, this timeline's going to increase. If you only have like the 2 days a week to get in the gym just for better health, it may take a little bit longer. Like, when we're talking from our journey of going from beginner to quote unquote intermediate, we were training hard multiple times a week. We were young. It was fun. And we didn't have any other responsibilities. That was just what we did.
Yeah, that was fun.
Yeah.
And really, bouncing off that, like, when you're a beginner and you want to be big and strong, here's the game plan. Eat plenty of protein, don't miss workouts, and train 3 to 4 times a week, and do that for 5 years. Like, there's this...
and train at a relatively high intensity.
Yes.
Like, continue to, again, push the weight, gauge your intensity, push the intensity, and make those progressive overload techniques. Apply them early on. Go back and listen to the last podcast if you want to learn all of those that you can apply in your training.
And there's so much impatience, especially as a beginner. I did it like, I need to bench 225 as quickly as possible. Instead of just waiting for you to be ready for it, and train accordingly with that goal in mind. Like, you're gonna get there. It's just
understand it will come.
But if you're missing workouts regularly, not eating well, not taking your sleep seriously, like, you're just delaying that even more. So have the long game in mind, that this is what I'm doing for the next 5 years. If this is something I truly want to do, if you want to get really strong, train for 5 to 10 years and don't miss workouts. And I promise you, you will. And I say train because we're not exercising. We're not just doing this for general health. It is incredibly healthy to be strong, but we are training with the specific goal of improving strength. Play the long game.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's probably the most fun part for me about powerlifting is I treat workouts differently now. Like, I used to treat practice for my sport. Like, it is not just lifting weights anymore. I'm not just doing it to like get a pump and like look cool. I'm doing it for a specific purpose and with a specific goal in mind. So it makes it more fun. I will honestly say that.
And not to get too sidetracked, but that really is my favorite part about strength training is I've done a lot of sports growing up. Wrestling will always be like my first love, but it's so honest. I had a lot of struggles with wrestling on the mental, psychological side of sports that cost me from getting over that hump. But strength training is so honest that you either put the appropriate work in and you get the desired result, or you don't.
Right.
That's a pretty simplified way of thinking about it, but it's also not, because taking recovery into account, these are all things that as a strength athlete, that's part of your job. So it's very honest with, if I have a goal that I want to hit and I don't get there, it's just because the work that I did was not conducive to that goal that I want to hit. Whereas wrestling and other sports and football, there's so much
chance and other things that go into it. I mean, especially in like a team sport, you have other people involved, all this kind of different stuff. But yeah, it's just you and the weights, and whatever work you're willing to put in is what you will get out of it. And whatever work you can put in is what you will get out of it. And it's one of the most rewarding things, not just in lifting, but in life. And just taking that lesson out of the gym and just understanding that if you put in the work and you do the hard things and push yourself through it, that you will get the desired result, and it will be awesome and even a bigger reward at the end of the day. So getting back to intermediate lifters. So we've gotten through this beginner stage. We're moving pretty proficiently. We're still making good progress because progress is not going to stall out at the end of the beginner stage and you're like, oh, I need to switch everything.
No, it's not a cut and dry. This is where it stops and ends. It's really a spectrum.
Right. So now we've reached kind of a couple, maybe a year or two at least into our training.
Yep.
We're moving pretty well, and it's like, okay, I think I'm ready to take the next jump and like really get stronger or get bigger in a certain area. We've reached what we'll call the intermediate stage. So now, where does the focus shift here to start?
So I will say, I think the intermediate stage kind of begins, and again, this is rough, might not apply to everyone, when you hit your first true plateau. Like, a lot of people think they're plateaued, but there's a lot of reasons they're missing their lifts that aren't just directly related to them not being a beginner anymore. So when you reach your first true plateau, like, I can't just go into the gym or the weight room and add more weight to the bar every session or every week. It's just not happening anymore. So once that true first plateau occurs is I think where we can start to think of someone more as an intermediate, as a rough indicator.
Okay.
But then I think our focus shifts to how can we practice these lifts more frequently, but also now we have to start managing fatigue and volume a little bit smarter because we're not going to recover because the weights are heavier. Even though 135 might be 100% of someone else's max, it's not the same as squatting 500. If that's 100%, it's a different type of stress. So we need to be smarter about how we can continue to squat multiple times a week while recovering and managing our fatigue and volume all at the same time.
Right.
And I don't know if you want to get into this now, but a couple strategies I use for continuing to practice lifts and get better at them is...
Yeah, I think this is kind of how we shift our training. So we've basically been coming in and just doing our basic lifts, probably some accessory movements to build some muscle outside of that. Then where does it go? Is it up in volume? Is it all these different things? So let's dive there.
I think it's increasing volume but spread out throughout the week. Whereas when you're starting out, you're going to just do the lift itself, like a basic barbell back squat. Whereas now we can start looking do we need to do more box squats? Do we need to do more, like tempo squats are one of my favorite ways to continue to getting really good at squats while managing fatigue and volume. So we can start looking at different variations of lifts for our big compound movements.
Yeah, we've mastered the lift already, or we've gotten proficient at the lift. Now how do we take that and kind of master this lift? So like a tempo squat, what does that do for somebody coming out of that beginner stage to help them make a jump?
I like thinking of it as learning how to own the position. So when you do tempo squats with a slow -3 count on the way down, 2-second pause in the hole, you're starting to realize like what your body should feel like in space throughout that entire movement. But also you're spending more time in the weakest part of that movement, which is in the hole.
Yeah.
And so now you can take weight off the bar, still get a really good training stimulus from adding that slow negative and pause in the hole without having to stress your body out with just adding more weight to the bar. And I think that was one of the biggest helps for me getting my squat from 445 to 502 in a year was just adding in more tempo squats, more work on positioning, and able to manage that fatigue anymore. I couldn't just squat 445 and then go in and squat 450 the next session.
Yeah.
It's just not going to happen at that point. So it allowed me to practice that, get really good at the movement, spend more time in the weakest part, and get 2 to 3 squat sessions in a week and still recover from it.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also going to help. Now we're improving range of motion. We're building muscle mass with the slow eccentrics. We're developing the power out of the hole, which again is the hardest part. You're going to fail most squats right above parallel, I would say, is the stopping point for most people. So you're spending more time in that position, getting stronger there, understanding what that is. And that goes for all the different lifts. Bench press on your chest, deadlifts just off the floor if you're a conventional deadlifter.
Like you should be.
Yeah. We don't even have to go there. We don't even have to go to sumo. But so then once we kind of have taken that route, should we be adding thinking about now adding more muscle mass, should we be adding more volume elsewhere besides our main lifts now that we've reached this kind of stage?
Yeah, I think I have some opinions on this, but also I want to get your feedback. Quinn's actually my coach right now. He's helping me with my my little off season. We're getting close to contest prep again, or meet prep. No bodybuilding.
I know. I always say the same thing. I'm like, oh yeah, it's prep. No, it's just peak.
Yeah.
We'll call it peak.
Yeah. So, anyways, so Quinn's got me on a lot of stuff that I'm not used to. That's helping me quite a bit. But the way I like to look at it is, when we have a lighter bench day that's not our heavy day, that might be a good day to include some harder dumbbell presses at a higher intensity. So maybe our bench press work that day isn't super hard, but we do a dumbbell incline press that's closer to that, 8 to 9 RP or 1 to 2 reps in reserve, somewhere in that range. So we're getting a great training stimulus, training a pressing movement at a different angle that's not putting the exact same stress on all our joints, but we can still push it pretty close to failure, builds quite a bit of muscle through a new movement that we can push harder, but because the weight's less, we can build muscle without adding a bunch of additional fatigue, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I mean, any of the barbell lifts are going to just be more fatiguing because they are going to use more of our body to do them, especially like back squats, deadlifts that put pressure on the spine. Finding other ways to build muscle and strength outside of those will only help with recovery. And
I think with as a general rule too, like one thing as an intermediate, we need to stop doing the just max when we feel like it. Anytime we're attempting a max, it should be planned way ahead of time. Let's just lay that on the table now.
Yeah.
So you don't have to be a power lifter to take this advice, but if you care about that raw strength number and that's something you want to bump up first, make sure you have a day in mind where you're going to test these numbers. And then with accessory movements, as a general rule, we always want to move from general to specific. So the closer we get to that competition or test day, our accessory work should be more specific to the task itself. And that's just basic sports science. We get better at things, the more specific to the task it is.
And don't go burn out your arms the day before you want to max out bench.
Right.
Make sure that you are peaking for that 1 rep test, whether it is, you're just a guy who wants a big bench press or you want a power lift. Like we have our taper weeks before a powerlifting meet because we want to max out our strength. You're not going to just walk into the gym one day and be like, you know what, I'm just going to max out my bench and see where it's at. Make sure you plan for that, especially at this stage, because those gains are taking longer. The rate of progress for that 1 rep max is going to take longer.
And it's heavier. It's inherently more dangerous to attempt a heavy max than a not so heavy max.
Yeah.
And I think it might be easier for everyone listening to kind of visualize this if we kind of lay out this is what 12 weeks of accessory work looks like. And let's say there's a test day 12 weeks away and I'm choosing my bench press accessories and we're going to move from general to specific. So in that first block of training, however long that may be, one of my pressing variations might be an overhead press. It's nothing like a bench press really. It's a completely different movement, but it's improving my overall
pushing strength.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to strengthen my shoulders, triceps. It's another one of those movements you could argue it's a full body movement. So that might be something good to include in, 12 to 16 weeks out. It's not completely different than a bench press, but it's different enough that you probably shouldn't be practicing it, 2 weeks before a bench press. So then maybe after that we move into a close grip bench where now it's way more like a regular bench or an incline bench. There's so many different options here. So now we're getting closer to that real movement. And then, next variation, maybe we're just doing a 2-second pause. In competition, it's just that 1 second pause, so a little bit longer. And then in that last phase, things are going to be a little bit closer to what you're doing for your actual test day or competition.
Yeah, and I think that's really crucial to understand is that specificity is key when it comes to strength, and especially when you're in this intermediate phase where progress becomes harder and harder. You have to continue to practice that lift at heavier and heavier weights that are in closer proximity to that 1 rep max to continue to get better at them under load. I get people all the time that can't get to like a 225 bench, or like some guys you'll meet that like just can't get to 315. And it's like, hey, what are you doing for your bench? And they're like, well, I do, incline dumbbell press, I do cable flies, I do a bunch of tricep work. And I'm like, so when do you bench? So making sure that the goal is in mind, especially in this phase. How do we transition nutrition and recovery in this phase? Does it have to kind of level up now that it's a little bit harder to make progress, or?
Yeah, I think you just need to be overall smarter with your training and recovery. Nutrition wise, the basics are always going to be the same, right? But we should be learning this whole time about the process of nutrition and where we feel our best. And if our goal is purely strength, we probably don't want to be dieting really hard during the phase of our training where we want to get really strong. Again, that's going to work for a beginner. It's going to make it way harder, but you can get away with it for a little bit. As you get stronger and stronger, dieting's really hard, just going to affect your recovery. Not saying you can't make strength gains in a deficit, but it's going to make that process a little bit harder.
Right, you kind of just have to phase your nutrition with what your goal is at the time now. So we have to have the basics in place at this point. We're eating enough protein. We're consuming a healthy amount of carbohydrates and fats. Like, we have our diet basically built.
The habits are there.
Yeah, the habits are there. We're, eating our 80% whole food diet, or we're on point for, 80 to 90% of the time, very consistently. We're consistent with our diet. That's the word I was looking for. But now we can just make those little tweaks now based on what our goal is. But if we don't have that consistency, you're really I think you're going to stall out a good bit in this stage trying to make these next strength and muscle gains.
Yep. And I think recovery really just comes down to, if you phase your training accordingly, you won't get beat up quite as fast. I do think this is a point in training where introducing deload weeks is helpful from a pure strength athlete perspective, more so than someone that just wants to generally get stronger over time, because those are two different things.
Yeah. When you're putting max loads on your back and getting up to 80, 90% of your 1 rep max on a regular basis, it takes something out of you. Like, at some point, you feel like you're kind of leaving part of you on under the bar, for lack of a better word. Like, there were some times in powerlifting training where it was like, I don't know if I can do another bump in weight. Like, I'm not really sure. So, I mean, that's probably at the next stage, but there will come a time that, like, if you're really pushing the strength, like, you can either deload or your body will tell you when it's time.
Yeah.
And you'll end up sick and not being able to do anything.
Yeah, and with that, we're going to, again, talking about rate of progression, it's going to take me longer now to hit a PR. So if I want to hit a new 5 rep max, what I'm going to do is structure my training in a way that on, 6 to 8 weeks from now is when I'm going to hit a new 5 rep max, and I'm going to structure my training accordingly. So if I have an 8-week block, I'm going to build up to a heavy set of 5. That's pretty much the most I can do over that period. And then the next 4 weeks, I'm going to maybe switch to triples or something like that for my main heavy sets, and then start somewhere between where I started that last block and where I ended. So, maybe I started at 405, I ended at 435. I might start that next block at 425 doing triples to start with some back off sets of 5. And then over that time, now my triples are getting stronger past what I did with my 5 reps. And then it's time to test that 5 rep max out again.
Yeah.
Because I've been accustomed to heavier loads at that point.
Right. And again, training specifically to your goal. When you're training for a 5 rep max, your training should probably be between 3 and 8 reps. If you're training for a 1 rep max, it should be between 1 and 5 reps. Making sure that the load is matching what you want to do later in training. Obviously, you're not going to hit it in training, but you want the load to be in proximity to that for sure.
No, I just out of curiosity, I don't want to get too off track, but when we were training for that meet, I feel like already going through now 3 preps for a meet, I've made so many mistakes and done some things wrong. Like, what do you think the next step is for us to make our training better?
I'm trying to kind of think about that now as we start to build up to it, because I'm kind of thinking of this in like the intermediate and advanced stages, and like, where are we? Like, are we actually advanced? Like, I'm not really sure, because I put on 50 pounds in my squat for this meet in like 4 months. So it's like, am I now at advanced? I don't know yet, because we haven't gone into like another strength block. But I think there were a lot of things like that we did right. Specifically, like just going heavy and kind of lower volume. I think pushing the weight was good. A lot of the stuff for fatigue management, like pin squats, I think really helped. Doing some lighter tempo work, I think was really, really good. I tried to keep in as much accessory work as I could. I don't know if that helped or hurt me. It hurt me in certain ways because I did accessory work on my shoulder that I should not have. So speaking from a pressing perspective, a bench press perspective, I think pulling the volume back for me is going to be the key there, and just making sure that I manage that. I think it's an ever evolving thing, especially with different lifts and
Different people that we work with too, because we had so many athletes competing those 2 days as well. But
Yeah.
my head just goes to like, especially those last few weeks of training where things are really heavy, like extending out that time to recover a little bit better so we're more prepared on meet day. But that's like, I think that's the reason I bring this up, is if you truly want to take the dive into getting really into strength training and getting as strong as possible, like, you have to embrace the challenge and like the puzzle that you're trying to solve. Is it's honestly like, I really used to get upset when I wasn't seeing progress, but now it's like, I look at it more as like a challenge that I get to solve, and I think that's part of the fun.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what we're doing now, is we're testing out kind of our off-season work of like, we're now doing more volume. We're really putting the volume into it while we can kind of recover from it, and we're not pushing as heavy of a weight, but we're still pushing the weight heavy. So we're trying to add in volume to see if we can add some muscle mass. So the way I kind of think of this here is we have those 3 stages to build strength. We have the motor skill and neurological development. We have the psychological aspect. That part's down. When we're in this intermediate stage, there's one more factor, and it's really muscle force. And a bigger muscle provides more force. So it's like, how do we get bigger muscle? Because now we've both figured out, okay, we know how to squat. We both hit a PR in our squat. How do I get bigger so that I can produce more force? Because my squat is only going to get so much better.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of where we're focused now. We'll see how that affects us come the time when we have to peak and when we go into that real powerlifting training, if we made the gains that we think we did.
I think that's kind of what separates beginner, intermediate a little bit too, is like the need to periodize your training becomes more apparent the more advanced you get. Talking about earlier, like I did a little 8-week cut right before summer, basically so I could grow into my weight without putting on too much excess body fat. It was not a good time for me to be pushing near max weights, and I'm glad I didn't.
Yeah.
And then I kind of phased into a hypertrophy phase. I'm starting at a new lower weight. Now we're increasing the volume, pushing closer to failure. I'm eating more so that I'm lowering my body fat so that I can grow back into 220 a little bit leaner with more muscle mass. And I think as an intermediate lifter, that's kind of where you're going to see that periodizing your training is going to become more important.
Yeah, getting more specific to your goal. So you have this, you come out of that beginner stage with a base of strength, a base of understanding how to work in the gym, like how to push intensity pretty hard. You've done some sessions that have made you really sore. You realize that was too much. You kind of understand, like I said, what you need to be doing in the gym. Now you've just hit that kind of plateau. So now in this intermediate stage, we need to figure out, where do our goals, what are really our goals, and how do we put everything in line to make it move in that direction now, because we have to be more specific and taking phases to get really strong, to go into muscle building phases, even some cuts to, again, lean yourself back out. You know, sometimes we get a little heavier than we would like, or you start to kind of go into that bulk and it reaches that point where it's like, oh, took it a little too far. Cut some of that weight back off, see if we can build back up leaner. I think all of these are really in that intermediate stage. So how do we know if we've reached that advanced stage? Are we ever truly advanced? This is the question that I came up with as I was thinking about doing this podcast. It's like, am I ever truly advanced? Like I said, I've been lifting for almost 20 years, and I put 50 pounds on my squat in 4 months. Like, and I considered myself kind of an advanced lifter. So it was like, was I just not advanced in strength training? Is there different ways to be advanced?
I think there really is like, you were doing a lot of high volume training, more bodybuilding style. I think you're really good at that style of training, and you might be more advanced in that area. And I actually don't know the answer to this, but that's what I suspect, because if you think of where we're at and people that are considered like the elite level, they're never going to put that much weight on a squat in that much time. So I think there's different ways to be advanced in certain areas of lifting, even within certain lifts. Like, you know, you've seen people who are bench specialists or deadlift specialists, and their squat isn't very good, or their squat's really good and their bench press sucks. Like, these things happen, and I don't think it's this super cut and dry thing where you can guarantee that someone's intermediate advanced. But what I do know is that when you've truly reached an advanced level, you can only hit certain lifts so frequently until that recovery toll becomes just too high. There are certain elite powerlifters that will train hard for 3 weeks and deload, or even I've heard of people doing 2 hard weeks in a deload because they're deadlifting 900 pounds. And they can't do multiple heavy deadlift sessions like that over the course of 3 to 4 weeks.
Like, I look at someone like, I'll just take Lane Norton because he's the example that's on top of my head. He squats like 660. And he's like, 500 still doesn't feel light.
Exactly.
And he regularly does like 500 to 550 for like sets of 3 to 5. And you're like, that is that is destroying your recovery. It's really hard to recover from that, regardless of how strong you end up getting. So the load just becomes so heavy to a point that nothing truly ever feels light, and nothing is ever quote unquote easy at this point.
Yeah, and I've seen guys that do their heavy squat session is every 10 days. Now they're still doing those squat variations that we talked about at a much lighter load, but their truly heavy day where they push that weight as hard as they can is like every 10 days. And, you know, we're not there yet. So I can't speak because I haven't experienced that advanced stage yet, but I think it really comes down to, again, you're hitting PRs maybe yearly. Like, it takes multiple training blocks perhaps to hit a PR. Maybe
like a 2.5 pound like PR.
Yes.
We're talking like small increments here at this level. So yeah, I mean, we're not even considering ourselves like in that advanced category. And I think this is kind of also where like genetics really come into play, is like once you've reached a quote unquote like genetic potential, or like you said, the guys who are really good at deadlift and bench, but they still suck at squat, like maybe they'll never be advanced at squat because their genetics suck for the squat.
Right.
Like their legs are super long or whatever it might be. So it's kind of one of those things, like this can really affect where you're at. And like I said, also even with like the bodybuilding aspect of it, I started, I think, when I was like 29 or 30, I decided to finally like really train my back really hard, because I just wasn't happy with where it had grown. And it'd been 15 years I'd been lifting, and I was like, this part of my body is lagging behind, and I decided to specialize in it and do it for 6 months, basically nonstop. All of my upper body training was back training, and it finally grew. So maybe that's a point where it's like, okay, now we need to start thinking about like very specialized training, taking time to like bring up the rest of our body to get us to that advanced stage. Like something's still kind of stuck in intermediate that finally gets us to advanced.
Yeah, and I think the big thing is not being afraid to admit where you're at, because it's not like a bad thing. There's no set time that it takes to become an advanced lifter, and I dread the day that I become one, because it's gonna just make
like you hear these guys talk on podcasts and they're like, I haven't hit a PR in like 5 years.
Yeah.
Or it's like, what? Like,
or like
that
I
can
trained
happen
for
to me?
a year to add 5 pounds to my deadlift.
Yeah. So don't be discouraged that you're not an advanced lifter. Neither one of us are advanced lifters. I will tell you that straight up. We have a lot of room to grow. G's 25. Like, there's dudes that do this into their 40s.
Yeah.
So we don't treat ourselves as quote unquote advanced. We are going to continue to push for gains. Don't assume like, oh, I'm just as strong as I will ever be. Because I think I kind of fell into that trap of like, I squatted 500 in college. Like I said, I have no idea what that 500 looked like, but it was on my back and I went down and up to some depth.
You're right.
So, but I was always like, I'll never get back to that. And now my goal is to get back to that, but it was because I just kept going into the gym every like 3 months. I'd be like, oh, okay, I want to try and get strong again. I'd train for 12 weeks and not be able to squat like 435. And I'm like, well, this is just stupid. But it's like, I never committed myself to doing it. I think,
and that's even a mental aspect of it.
Yeah. I mean, I think at that intermediate stage, it's like, if you truly want to advance off of that or advance through that stage, it takes just a bigger commitment to say, like, there is room for me to grow. I can push myself harder. I can do more range of motion. If you want to get bigger muscle, I can get more range of motion. I can push myself closer to failure. I can, play with exercise selection. Like, there's all kinds of things you can do to keep progressing. And I think we're just kind of scratching the surface of like, how far can I really take this?
And not getting obsessed with those 1 rep maxes is super important. A majority of your training should not be maxes or singles anyway. That's a very specific purpose that you incorporate singles into your training. Now, there's lots of reasons you might do that, but I've always found better results when I'm chasing new 5 rep maxes, new 3 rep maxes, new maxes for a double. Those things tend to, if your sets of 3 to 6 are getting stronger, your 1 rep max is going to go up. And that's where we want to look at our rep ranges of like those sets of 3 to 6, 4 to 6, doesn't really matter where that bottom end is, but those 3 to 6 rep range is where we're going to build a base of strength that's longer lasting. Like, you hit singles to kind of break through plateaus so that you can then add more weight to those sets of 3 to 6 where you're really building your foundation of sets. So if there's something that everyone can take away from this, regardless of your level, is really focus on that 3 to 6 rep range and use singles as a way to kind of boost yourself out of maybe those little mini plateaus that you might hit. If those 3 to 6 rep range movements are going up, then you're going to get stronger, and it's going to be a longer lasting strength. Like, I use a lot of singles to almost peak for whether that be
you have to practice your single to be able to make sure you can do the single and know like that step-by-step process, know exactly what that feels like. But like you said, the adaptations are going to come from more tension on the muscle and more time under load, which is going to be in that 3 to 6 rep range. But it's still going to be heavy enough to make the strength adaptation.
Right, and from a recovery standpoint, the amount of stress you have to go to do like 5 heavy singles as opposed to 1 heavy set of 5, those 5 heavy singles might make you stronger, but the recovery cost you pay for that might not be worth it, because the goal isn't necessarily to get as strong as you can today. It's how to string together as many solid training sessions as you can in a row. Like we touched on deloads a little bit. You want to deload as infrequently as possible. As you get really strong, they have to happen more often. But remember, your goal should not be to like necessarily max out any of those rep ranges every single time when you're in the gym, when your goal is to get stronger, because you need to put together as much consistency as you can, and that's where the strength really increases.
Yeah. That's why I don't normally even plan a deload in. Like, I'll have a program that's like, it might kind of fit here, and I'm kind of thinking about it now as I've been pushing the volume, especially on my legs. I'm like, I don't know how much longer I can actually do this, but I'm going to keep going until the weight doesn't, or the reps don't go up, since we're practicing volume. But I think that's kind of just making sure that you're very mindful of like what you're recovering from. Or am I actually recovering? Am I ready to go by the next time I have to squat? Or is it a real drag just to get yourself out for that session? Or are your legs still sore by that session?
Yeah, and bouncing off that with like intermediate training, as someone who's trying to get stronger, is you have to think longer term in that sense. It's like, right now, I'm trying to get stronger for the next training block, not necessarily to hit a PR right away. So if you can view your training as, I'm getting ready for this next phase of training, so I'm a little bit stronger for that.
Yeah.
Leading up to like that test day or competition day, that's going to serve you much better, because you're not going to be able to just add 5 pounds to your max all of a sudden. You got to train for the next period of training where your goal is to push that weight a little bit more.
Starting to kind of periodize that. And I think about this for our TFW students that are listening. And for those of you that don't know, it's Training for Warriors. It's our group training system. We do a 1 rep max every month on a different lift. And that lift comes around every 6 months. So, when we're coming up on what the next month will be, it's, barbell back squats. This month, we're working on our depth and range of motion for barbell back squats, so that when we get into the next training block, we're all able to hit depth comfortably, and then we can start to push weight for that 1 rep max. So what we're doing now is not necessarily getting us a stronger 1 rep max, but it is getting us stronger at the squat, so that we're at a better starting point for our 1 rep max training.
Exactly.
So it kind of, we periodize that in, but I think, students get upset that, their 1 rep max isn't going up, but I don't know if they're thinking about the training leading up to those months as that practice for the practice.
Right, and 1 rep maxes are such a specific task, we'll call it. Like, it's something that requires, there's very little room for error when you're dealing with 100% of your 1 rep max. So for TFW, the goal is to lose fat, build muscle, feel good, improve health, get generally stronger over time. Like, I think people should get more excited than they do when they hit a new 3 rep max. And even if that doesn't result in a heavier 1 rep max,
you still got stronger.
You still got stronger, because that you might have just been one little technical mistake away from hitting that max, but again, you're making those small improvements.
You might have had a shitty night of sleep before that, or gotten in a fight with your significant other that day and been stressed out, or you're stressed out at work, and that 1 rep isn't there that day because that's not all you're thinking about. Like, when you see powerlifters on the platform, that's all they've been doing and thinking about for 12 weeks. Everything has led up to that single day.
And they still sometimes don't hit PRs.
Yeah, and you still don't hit your PR, or something goes wrong. So anything can happen on that one given max day. So yeah, focus on, where am I getting stronger in my training? What are those other maxes that I'm hitting? Where are the other places I'm making progress? And really celebrate those, for sure.
Yeah, and that might be a good thing just to kind of cover, because it kind of relates to what we're doing. Is, I think it's important, like, this might not be the style of training that you want to pursue. I would recommend that strength becomes something you value in your training, but it doesn't have to be this process where the only thing you're worried about is getting as strong as possible. But over time, it always scares me a little bit when people are like, well, I don't really care about how much I'm lifting. But it's at a certain point, especially as a beginner, the weight has to increase so things get hard enough for you to see the progress that you want.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where my style of training with everyone comes in, is we kind of prioritize strength because it's the most straightforward way of making that progress at the beginning, even though a vast majority of the people I work with are not strength athletes and never will be. I always make sure that they have that base of strength there, because it makes daily life easier, improves confidence, and you don't have to be a strength athlete to take things from this. It's just realizing that progress in terms of strength will be slower, and that's okay. That's a good goal to have, is like, just generally over time, weights slowly go up. You're getting a little bit better, and you might never test 1 rep maxes or care about that. But it is a good thing to at least have strength as some sort of goal in your training.
Yeah, and what's the best indicator that I am gaining muscle? That I am getting stronger in the gym. Either I am able to do more reps or I am able to do more weight. If you're able to do those two things and you are gaining weight, there is a very good chance that a significant amount of that is muscle mass. And eventually, you are going to reach an amount of reps that you are not going to want to do, not be able to recover from, or you just won't be able to fit them all into your session. So eventually, you're going to have to add weight.
Yeah.
So even if you're getting stronger at doing 20 reps of something, guess what? You're still getting stronger.
Yep.
And getting yourself stronger will only make you stronger at those other accessory movements, allow you to be able to push harder. So I think to kind of wrap this up, bring it full circle. When you start out as a beginner, the goal is let's build a foundation of strength. Let's understand our nutrition, get our recovery in a place that, again, just builds that foundation. The whole beginner stage, we're building a foundation. You'll build the foundation of muscle while building strength. That will be great. Eventually, we're going to hit a point where that will tap out. We won't be able to make as quick a rate of progress. Once you start to see diminishing kind of returns in that progress, now we've reached the next stage, and I think the goal is to probably just get a little bit more targeted in exactly what our goals are at the time, making sure that we're periodizing our training to that goal and that our nutrition and recovery comes with it. We're constantly kind of monitoring how those two things are playing into how we feel in the gym. What else would you add to that, if anything?
I think this is just a super specific thing I see is there's a big, I guess, popularity now with bodybuilding and bodybuilders. And I think that's getting a lot of young men, especially, into the gym and teenagers, which I think is great that, they have something to strive for. But I think there's a big problem with trying to replicate the training they see bodybuilders doing. Mm-hmm. But they don't realize that bodybuilders, the ones they're looking at, Chris Bumstead, that guy benches like 500 pounds. Like, these guys are very, very strong.
Yeah.
And they did build their foundation with strength training. It's just they're too strong to the point where that's not the best way to train for bodybuilding anymore. So realize that, I know that's a very specific population, but it's someone that I used to be, and realizing that you'll be better off making those strength gains at the beginning before you try and replicate anything that a bodybuilder might be doing.
Right, and I think the other thing I want to touch on with that is that everything does not have to be optimal.
Right.
Everything does not have to be the perfect exercise. You don't have to worry about hitting every single part of your lat when you start out. Get your lats stronger. Understand how to move your body. All of those bodybuilders that you see, they either actually do things like barbell rows, lat pull downs, pull-ups. They've gotten really good at those things before they got to the point where they needed to optimize and max out their physique to the absolute max. That's not you probably right now. You'll eventually maybe get to the point where you can incorporate some of that work and it might be necessary. But if you don't have the strength and the foundational muscle to do that, don't worry about it. Not everything has to be optimal. If you're getting in the gym, moving with good form, range of motion, and pushing the weights, you will grow and you will get stronger.
100%.
All right, so that kind of wraps up that topic that we wanted to talk about of, the stages of lifting, where we're at, how we make progress, how we get stronger at each stage, the things we need to focus on. Next thing I want to get into is we did have one listener question. I posted it on Facebook and Instagram. Always comment on the post on the podcast and things like that if you want your questions answered. This is the Lifting Cues podcast. I want to answer your questions. But Janelle had a great question. She said, you say you have a mental checklist for the big 3 lifts, and she asked if you could kind of walk us through that, and I want you to walk us through it and say why it's important. And I want to do this as well. I want to answer this question to see how our mental checklist differs for the lifts. But if you just want to walk us through kind of each of the lifts, the mental checklist that you go through.
All right, let's go SBD. We'll start with squats. Try to make this pretty time efficient. But before we get into this, I will say my opinion has changed slightly on this. I think a mental checklist is super important especially when you're starting out, because you want to check all the boxes that are going to make your movements as efficient as possible. But I got into a little thing where I was overthinking everything, and it became a little too much. So starting with squats, I always start out, at this point, grabbing the bar at an even grip is like second nature. I don't even think about doing that, but that's how I start. I duck my head through. I'd say the first part of my mental checklist starts with me tightening my back. So feeling me pinch my shoulder blades back against the bar, making sure I'm creating that solid foundation and solid base for the bar to sit.
It's a beautiful thing to watch when you spot Coach G. His back just eats the entire bar.
That's like the best compliment anyone's ever given. Coach Quinn said,
it makes me so jealous. He eats the whole bar.
Yeah, he said my back looks huge when I squat, which is like the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me. So I tighten up my back, and then normally, we're always assuming it's heavy, so I brace to take the bar out of the rack, and then I have a 4-step walkout. I'm working on shortening it to 3. I don't want to walk any further with 500 pounds on my back. Yeah. So I do a 4-step walkout. I go 1, 2, and then the next 2 steps are more of just evening my stance. So shifting my feet, making sure small adjustments are there, that my toe angle is the same on both sides. After that, I corkscrew my feet into the floor and grab the floor with my toes. So claw my toes into the floor, corkscrew my knees out so that I'm creating that tension on the way down. Take my eye gaze to about 4 to 5 feet in front of me. I take a big breath through my mouth like I'm breathing through a straw, fill up my belt, and from there I just kind of squat after that point. So that's kind of it for squats. Do you want to go yours now?
I'll go with mine. So I'm kind of the same as you, is that it's now just become a second nature thing. And I think that's the goal of the mental checklist.
Yes.
Is make it second nature. So this checklist should be done on every single set. If you watch me squat, bench, or deadlift, every single set starts exactly the same. So with squats, I've now started like walking up to the bar, like almost practicing, kind of your walk up, but I'll literally walk up to the bar, set my hands, grab it, and then I go under, do the same thing. I tighten my back, and I pull myself into the bar.
Mm-hmm.
You'll see me do a little shimmy a lot. Mm-hmm. I like to shimmy on my deadlift, but I do it, I think, on squats too. I'll shimmy in, and then I get set, lift the bar out. I don't know how many steps I take, mm-hmm. but I think I do 2 and then kind of set my feet. And then from there, it's just a look up, that big breath, brace the core, and then I'm gone. Mm-hmm. And the squat from there, again, that's going to become second nature, especially by the time you've done enough weight. But I do like to keep my gaze down now. Like I said earlier, I realized at one point I was arching too high. So I like to look down, and then, it just kind of goes from there. And just making sure that I'm pushing into my belt the entire time. That's really all I'm thinking about, is holding my brace and letting my legs do what they do. My legs are strong enough to lift anything. I'm only ever going to fail a lift with my core.
Right.
So my legs know what to do.
And kind of before we move on, the point of the mental checklist, like we said, is to develop confidence with that movement, so it becomes second nature, like Coach Quinn said. But also, I think a big part of it is controlling things that you can't control on the fly, right? Mm-hmm. So, I need to make sure I'm driving my knees out and rotating my feet into the floor, because I'm not going to be able to make that transition with 500 pounds on my back on the way down. So even though our form might change a little bit as weight increases, because it always breaks down.
Yeah, at some point.
It's kind of checking those boxes to make sure, the bar stays over the middle of the foot. We're firmly planted on the floor with both feet. Our lats are tight. So it's checking all the little boxes that you don't want to have to think about during the movement itself.
Right, especially when it gets heavy. Mm-hmm. I don't want to have to think about how many steps do I need to take? What is all this stuff? It's no, I need to think about executing, and that needs to feel like second nature, because I'm focused on what I have to do, and for me, how heavy the weight feels on my back.
Yep.
I'm not one of those people that tries to pretend like it's not.
No, it's heavy every time.
All right, bench press.
Bench press. Take my grip. Grip's going to vary, not super important because it's so variable. Take my grip. I pull my nose up to the bar, and I actually touch my nose on the bar every time, and I create as big of an arch as possible. I'll I'll lift my hips too. So I lift my hips, I'm arching as hard as I can so that I can set my goal is to set my traps down on the bench. Now I don't really quite get there, but that's what I'm thinking about as I take that arch, is setting my traps down on the bench. And then once I'm set in that position, I'm actually almost doing like a shrug backwards, pulling my shoulders against the bench. Unrack, I guess that's my step one, is arch. Next, pull the shoulders back, and then I think about unracking using only my triceps so I can maintain that tension with my back. So it's just a tricep extension, and then think about doing a pullover out to center. And then the last checklist I have is I brace on a bench just like I would on a squat. Is I take that breath into my core, lock everything in tight, and then I have one mental checklist, and bench is the only one I do this on the way down, is I'm thinking about trying to meet the bar halfway with my chest. What this does for me is my chest probably doesn't actually move up any higher, but when it gets really heavy, it prevents me from unracking and caving in.
Yep.
I want to maintain that good arch that I took all that time to get. So at that point, I'm trying to meet the bar halfway, and really that's about it. At that point, it's just pushing.
I love it. I actually like that one a lot.
I do think bench is the most technical lift of the three, so there's other things I'm thinking about, but not really, because they kind of work themselves out with that checklist.
Yeah. So for me, I lay down, I grab the bar, and then I set my feet. I actually set my feet first. I bring them all the way in, as far in as I can, and keep them flat on the floor, corkscrew, and squeeze my glutes hard. And that gives me an automatic arch. Then I grab nice and tight, and I get that same arch. I don't pull up as high as he does. I can't arch my back like G does either, but I get as much of an arch as I can, and then I lock that in, lock my lats in place, and then it's from there, I just, again, go through and make sure everything is tight again, and I grip the shit out of the bar. Like, I try to squeeze it as hard as I can, because that's going to keep me as tight as possible. And then same thing, really, lift it off, make sure everything stays tight, take that one last brace, and then I think about just pulling the bar down. Like, the bar's not falling. I'm literally pulling it to my chest and then driving back up toward my face so that the bar comes up over my shoulders. That's really my mental checklist. My bench press sucks, though, so you can use mine if you want, but I don't know if you want to.
Well, I've been in like a 2.5 year plateau at this point, too, so maybe neither of us are the way to go with that. And then deadlift. This is what caused me to rethink my whole thought process on it and think less. So I'll lay out my checklist I give to everybody that's learning to deadlift, and I think this is the best way to start. Now,
sneak peek of the deadlift seminar.
Yeah, right. See you in August. So I didn't make this up on my own. It worked for me. It's actually the starting strength deadlift setup. I think it's a great way for anyone to learn to deadlift, and then you can make micro adjustments based on hip height after this point. So this is a good starting point for anyone that doesn't have a checklist or deadlifting for the first time. First thing, 1 inch away from the bar, just measure it with your eyes. It's going to be close enough. If you're still not sure, cover your shoelaces right where they're tied with the bar. So you want a little bit of space. From there, we're going to reach down. I have people grab the bar without bending their knees. So literally just hunch over, grab the bar. From there, I have them push knees forward. And this is how I set up for over a year. Push your knees forward till your shins meet the bar. That's your hip height, at least starting out. That's where you set your hips. And then you're going to drive your knees out into your elbows. After that, that's where we're going to extend our back. So we're doing that cat-cow, getting our back into a neutral position, maybe slight extension. And from there, big brace into your stomach. And always think about pushing the floor away from you. If you try and stand up too quick by pulling up with your back, you're not gonna maintain that angle over that bar, that back angle. Should be like a book opening. So we want to just push our heels so we can stay over the bar and have leverage over it. Since then, I've adjusted. This is a good point, because I spent 2 years doing that setup every single time I deadlift, but I'm comfortable to the point is where I can combine steps and make it a little bit more efficient.
Yep.
I would get to the bottom and overthink it and not be able to pull that tension out of the bar like I like to. So what I do now is I step up to the bar. I'm still 1 inch away. My toes are slightly out. I corkscrew my feet. I push my lats down and make my arms as long as possible. So I have to pull the bar the smallest distance possible. From there, I take my brace at the top now. So I breathe into my belt, get that tight brace, and I just bend over and pick it up. What I do after that, I know I'm in a good position, and
You're just pulling as hard as you can.
And
at that
the
point.
crazy part is how well this works for me. So I don't know that it'll work because I made that change probably 3 weeks out from the meet, which I don't recommend changing your technique that late. But I was stuck and needed something to change. And since then, there's a lot less going on up here and just more drive off the floor. So that's worked pretty well for me.
Yeah, and I actually stole your deadlift setup to teach people as well. So
It's not mine, so
either
I
way,
stole it from someone.
when I came here, I struggled to teach people the deadlift. That one does work very well. Didn't think about the knees pushing out. That's a good one. But for me, my deadlift setup is a little bit longer. If I do the kind of deadlift setup, the grip it and rip it style that G does, my back is going straight to round. I can't get a brace from top and hold it all the way through down to the bottom. My back, like I'm going straight cat, all neck to pick that deadlift up. So for me, it's again, walk up to the bar and I set my feet. Right foot always goes in first. I make sure that's lined up. I line up my left foot. Then I hit a nice lat spread. Make sure I can feel my lats engage. I come up. And then I come down. Same thing, straight legs. I grab the bar, shimmy my hips a little bit. I bend my knees and then lock my lats in. And then it's just a brace of that core. Maybe some stretch reflex. I'll tend to, get a little bit of hip into it just because I kind of have to it's almost me psyching myself up and making sure that I'm pulling the slack out of the bar. And then from there, it's just, push through the floor as hard as you can and just keep going.
Yeah.
And if I get it past my knees, I know I'm good. But if I can't get it to my knees, that's where I'm going to fail every single time. But yeah, that's my checklist is I kind of go through a little bit more of a setup just because my deadlift is not quite as strong. My back is not quite as strong for whatever reason. I'm not able to hold the position. Yeah, we're getting there. But it's feeling pretty good. The weight keeps moving and my back doesn't hurt anymore. So that's really the key. But
shout out for a great question, honestly.
Yeah.
If he could get more of those, I'm sure he'd love that. So
yeah, absolutely. Any of the mindset stuff of what really goes into lifting, I think that's the stuff we really get excited about because for us, once you reach a certain point, again, the lifts kind of become second nature. It's all of the psychological game of how do you make sure that, you can hit the weights that you want or the reps that you want in that session and make sure that you're making progress. And how do you push yourself to that point? That's, I think, really the game that we all start to play. And that's when, to me, training becomes the most fun.
Yep.
It's not a thing I have to do anymore. It's a thing I get to do to test myself and see where I'm at and just how can I get that much better. And I think if you can take that mindset into the gym of I'm doing this to get better. How can I get better today? Even if I'm not where I want to be, that's okay. Let's just keep getting better. And those kind of games that you play with yourself almost of in that mental space that you get into, I think is the most fun.
Yeah, and I guess my last little bit here would just be keep playing the long game and enjoy the process that it goes with. You shouldn't be in a hurry to get to your strongest self because it's not going to end up working for you. If you can just really start to embrace the challenges that come up and realize that that's just problems to solve and have some fun with it, it becomes a lot more fun. And I'm enjoying lifting more than I ever have just because it's such a unique and fun challenge. It's also super honest.
Yeah, and I think getting to do it with someone like Coach G and Coach Brandon, when we get to lift together, that's the most fun. So if you have a community in a gym that really embraces that, I think the way that we do, that's something not to take for granted. It is so much fun to lift with other people and push yourselves and compete with each other in a supportive way and just
talk a little shit along the way too.
And just have fun with it. I think that's something that can't be understated and how great that is. But it was awesome having you on here. I'm glad we got to have this conversation.
Appreciate it.
Let's do it again. Where can the people find you? And any last words you want to say?
Cool. You can find me on Instagram, Coach_G_CSCS, or just Coach Gehrig on Facebook if you're on there. Staying pretty active on there, so come on, hang out, enjoy the stuff I post, and come interact with my stuff.
All right, lifters, keep getting strong.
Later, guys. Stay strong.
Thank you guys so much for listening to this podcast. This was a great episode of the Lifting Cues podcast, the podcast for lifters. Remember, if you like this episode, please like, rate, subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Share it on social media. Tag me at CoachQ_fitness on Instagram. Tag Coach G, Coach_G_CSCS. And let us know what you thought of this podcast. Share it with your friends if they want to dive deep and nerd out on strength training like we did. I really enjoyed doing this. It was so much fun. We looked at the clock by the time it was over, had no idea how long we had talked. We probably could have talked for another 3 hours. We'll probably do this again. It was a great time. I really hope you enjoyed it. And until next week, lifters, keep getting big.